Hello and welcome to the Nutritionist Podcast. I'm your host, Ismail Zutat. On today's episode, we are talking all things gut health with a very special guest all the way from a land down under. It's Jan Macfarlane. Jan is a clinical nutritionist based in Adelaide, Australia, with over 10 years experience as a resident nutritionist, nutritionist feature writer, and clinical nutritionist. The list really does go on and on and on. She is such a fascinating guest with such a fascinating personal story behind that. I personally think this episode was one of my favorites to record. And remember to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this episode. All the links to Jan's social media and website will be posted into the description. And remember, take a seat back, relax, and enjoy the episode with some popcorn, preferably with little or no sugar. Welcome to the Nutritionist Podcast. I'm your host, Ish. On today's episode, for our next guest, we're traveling to a land down under. She's an accredited clinical nutritionist based in Adelaide, Australia, specialising in evidence-based functional testing and treatments. She has over 10 years work experience as a resident nutritionist, nutritionist feature writer, clinical nutritionist, and the list goes on. Finally, on her website, she is something of a French culinary chef with a library of delicious recipes that makes even the most disciplined dieter makes their mouth water, I'm sure. Introducing Jan Macfarlane.
Hello, thanks for having me.
It's
so
a
exciting.
pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure. I wanted to quickly ask Jan, I wanted to go into depth about, because you're actually our first guest who happens to be a clinical nutritionist rather than, say, the traditional holistic nutritionist, which you, I'm sure, have come across in your time as a nutritionist. I wanted to ask you, what guided you to becoming a clinical nutritionist?
Yeah, that's a good question. In my 20s, and I'm now in my late 30s, I actually came down with an autoimmune myself. And I was a young mum, working, studying, stressed, doing all the things that people do. And yeah, I got quite sick, and I'd already been on the path to sort of figure out mental health and well-being, just being a mum in general. So I started becoming interested in health. And the final tipping balance that pushed me into it was my mum sadly passed away. And that was really obviously such a hugely emotional event and had a huge impact on me. The back history was that she had some severe mental health issues. She suffered from schizophrenia my whole life. So I'd been touched with mental health ever since I was younger. And what comes with that severe grief is a long time wading through that. And after that, I came through it and thought, you know what, I'm going to get up, I'm going to live, and I'm going to make something positive come from this. And I'm going to go out and I'm going to help people. And I thought, what's the number one thing that really impacts us from the inside out? And that's nutrition. And I thought, if I'm going to help people with nutrition, I'm going to help them holistically, not just with, here's a meal plan, see you later. Because it's not just that, it's everything. And then also making sure that when I treated them, I got to the root cause. So functional testing came into that clinical aspect. So using evidence-based tools to really get to the cellular level of what's going on for this individual, as well as their holistic overview of everything else that impacts them. So could really get them, underlying good testing measures. Pre-treatment, post-treatment, so they weren't just going around the ringer, because I did for 7 years to get my own diagnosis and find that in the front line there's sort of a big disconnect with getting the right testing and then people sort of all coming together holistically to treat somebody. That's in a long-winded answer.
Yeah, no, that's an amazing. I mean, I'm quite a moving story, to be quite frank, and it's incredible the journey you've kind of come across, and the fact that you've decided that this was the path you wanted to take, and with all the things that have happened, it's an incredibly moving story. But actually, you touched upon something that really quite fascinated me. You mentioned that you promote a kind of a fusion, I suppose, between the holistic approach and the clinical approach. Can you give me a bit more detail as to this approach and how it differs from, say, the average nutritionist?
Yeah, so what I've found, even in my own personal health journey, seeking out practitioners, seeking out help with diagnoses and treatment plans was that I might get somebody look at me holistically. That means sit down and really ask me my whole overview of life, not just a quick 15-minute snapshot of acute symptoms. It's what's gone on X amount of years ago, what's happening now, you know, what kind of stresses do you have in your lifestyle? What are you doing for self-care? Of course, what are you eating? You know, not all of that gets taken in. That's the holistic overview. And then the clinical aspect is the treatment testing. So obviously, you know, science is amazing and it's not always perfect, but it's a lot better than just going on symptoms. So, you know, getting diagnostics is the clinical aspect where you can fuse both of those together and you can get the best snapshot you can possibly get that science can offer, as well as the patient's whole life overview to really fit them together like a puzzle.
I mean, it's quite interesting because I know a lot of nutritionists really do have a preference, I suppose, for one or the other, but it's very rare to come across someone who kind of takes in both, I suppose, and kind of maximizing on trying that diagnostic approach and that kind of whole systems approach, which I suppose the holistic style really focuses on, while also kind of having a foundation there of the clinical approach, which I guess, you know, from my perspective, I mean, I've only ever met, you know, either a very clinical nutritionist where everything is just very much black and white. You know, they have a set of biomarkers, and once the threshold is met, that's it, that's the condition, and that's how they'll discuss it. It's very clinical, dare I say. And then obviously you have the kind of more holistic approach, and those very much range from individuals who are kind of like, you know, everything from discussing a whole systems approach from, you know, birth to death, all the way through to individuals who will describe your chakra being out of line and whatnot. So, I mean, it really, I mean, you do have the full umbrella there. So I suppose having a fusion is really, really interesting. And I suppose I completely agree with it, because I suppose, you know, you have to have a both a two-sided, well, like a coin, it has to be two-sided in that sense. You know, there isn't just one approach, but actually a fusion of two approaches is very fascinating. How have you kind of found that it works with sort of your clients? How have they responded to that kind of approach? And if I may ask, what are some of the success stories that have come about as a consequence of this approach? And I wanted to know some of the great success stories of your career in that sense.
Yeah, cool. I can definitely touch on that. There are lots of, interestingly, there are a lot of barriers in testing, or here in Australia anyway, and that's due to pricing. And I believe that, you know, it can be very similar in places like America, where they don't have really good health systems to cover medical care at all. So that's where it becomes a bit of a barrier for patients, because the treatment cost for the practitioner is less, because we see each other less. We do testing, we find out exactly what's wrong, we work out a plan, the patient implements that plan over several weeks, we retest at some point. So our touch points are less, so less money spent with the practitioner, but the testing is quite expensive and it's not always covered by the government. So that's probably a big barrier I've found with fusing the two together, which I'd like to see the gap close over the coming years. Hopefully the government will recognise these tests and push them into the front line a bit more. But on the positive side, if patients were able to find the funding or justify the funding, I've had some incredible outcomes, and that's what drives us as practitioners, these wins, to see people's lives turn around and, you know, see someone go from, you know, struggling just to get through the day to, you know, perhaps just completely in remission and taking the trip that they couldn't even get on an airplane to do, or being able to reestablish relationships and work again and stuff like that, which is really, really incredible.
Is there a particular client, would you say, that really kind of stands out? Because I know I have one, for example, who's a former banker, and he was quite morbidly obese, for example. This is just kind of my example of like, and this is before I was even a nutritionist. Actually, I was just a personal trainer back in those days. I was 18 years old, and, you know, just starting out, and I just had this one client that yeah, he was just very different from the rest. He kind of just stood out, and it's one that always to this day, very day, just stands out as like a reference point as to something that I'm very proud of, well, being on this journey with him, I suppose. And yeah, he was very reluctant at first, I suppose, and his lifestyle was just incomplete. We continuously conflicted on like how he should adapt and what changes he should implement within his life. And long behold, those small changes did start taking effect. And yeah, he ended up losing an incredible amount of weight, and he could start, relaxing, and he was far more relaxed. The anxiety in his life had just decreased exponentially, and he was able to spend more time with his children, and his children were happier, and his life was happier, his marriage was happier. And I'm just sitting there, this 18-year-old kid, just saving this 45-year-old man's marriage, and it's amazing. And I was thinking, I can't believe I've done this is amazing. Obviously it was
Wow.
his work. He'd done the hard work. I can't say that I did it all for him, but it was amazing to have been part of that journey and to provide him with that kind of essential advice. So I just wanted to know, there must be one, I suppose every nutritionist has one that really stands out.
Yeah, that's such a great story, and that's the incredible part for us, isn't it? Because it's not just they're suffering from being overweight or having a chronic illness, it's the flow-on effect to their whole life.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
the one that I would say touched me heavily was, there are a lot that do, but some just stay with you, don't they? And this was a young girl, and it's a young lady. She was about 21. So had all of her life in front of her, and she was an athlete. She played tennis, and she just was so vibrant. But she came down with ulcerative colitis, which is an inflammatory condition of the bowel, as you know. And if anybody doesn't know, it's quite debilitating, similar to Crohn's. So it attacks the gastrointestinal tract. And the unfortunate path to that, if it's not managed, is removal of the bowel.
Oh, wow.
And then that can end up with needing assistance with a type of bag that catches the stool, and then they're not able to use their bowels, and it's quite debilitating and crippling, especially at a younger age. So she had been down the frontline path, as they do, obviously, and that's the correct thing to do initially. You do need to go via a gastroenterologist just to make sure that it's not anything in the bowel disease world. That's really important. And obviously ruling out bowel cancers and things like that. And so she had the diagnosis, and the frontline acute medical care for that is to give the patient things like immune suppressants and steroids. And that's kind of it's not really diet related. They don't give them anything around diet, which is really interesting. And unfortunately, none of that was working for her, and she was leaning towards the point of having to get her first removal done. So they take section by section. Typically, they don't remove the whole thing. But she came to me, and we did functional testing on her, and she said, "Yeah, I want to know. I just want to know." So do all the testing, and we uncovered a few aspects. So nobody had tested her anti-glade and IgA. So that's actually quite a simple one. People typically do get tested by a GP. So she was building antibodies to gluten. So that was causing a lot of inflammation in her bowel, and that's rare. That's not everyone does, but that came up. She also had a lot of hydrogen sulfide producers in her gastrointestinal tract. And for anyone that doesn't know what that is, these guys are just little bacteria that like to eat animal protein. So for these particular patients, it's a really good idea to be more plant dominant to help that bacterial ratio smooth out, because these guys cause a lot of inflammation as well. So just by shifting those two things within a few months and giving her things to help sort of soothe the inflammation in the bowel, eucalypt herbs and other things that you can do, she went into full remission, which is just crazy. And has stayed into full remission, gone back to playing tennis, and I believe she's engaged now and just living the life of a young 20-year-old as she should. So that was really magical.
That's quite that is magical beyond magical. That is an amazing story. And the fact that doctors were, making sure they were kind of guiding her towards a very debilitating life with disease, essentially. And the fact that there was no solution from their end, it's shocking. But it just goes to show, I suppose, the lack of functional training doctors get these days on nutrition. And just the whole systems approach, it does not exist within the medical world. So it's amazing to see clinical nutritionists out there actually, picking up the buck and actually, helping other individuals. There are so many more out there, I'm sure, that obviously require that and probably never have the opportunity to see one. So for anyone listening out there, if you feel like you might have a gut issue, it might not always be the best solution to run to the doctors right away. There are nutritionists out there, clinical nutritionists, who might just be able to provide something alternative and something that may be able to provide you with a solution that doesn't involve horrid, operations that will leave your life in a lesser adequate form. You mentioned that a lot about gut health, and the terminology that you use is incredible. I suppose it almost begs the question: are you a gut expert? And I see from your website that you do have a particular passion for gut health. And I wanted to ask for our audience, from a layman's perspective, what is gut health all about?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I definitely came to this path through real curiosity and interest as science just kept exploding, as we could look into the microbiome and the effects of our gut bacteria on the whole body, and the enteric nervous system and the effects to the brain. And just, it's astounding really what we know now, that it really is our second little brain, or we could call it first brain. And it affects up to 70% of our immune system. That's just huge, huge. And then when we look at the areas of it, I think people think gut health and they just think, oh, my stomach. What? And then what happens? I know, like, obviously my stomach, and I know the end point of that. What else happens? So, and people get really shy talking about it, but when you're a practitioner, you talk about it all the time, so you kind of lose that squeamishness, don't you? I just feel like I'm so used to talking about it, but
the amount of time stool must be discussed must just be incredible, right? Just I mean, I remember when I first had to actually do stool analyses and whatnot. Those were quite, at first, they can be quite squeamish to look at, both the collection and the sampling, and also the testing that you have to do on those. Yeah. But over time, you kind of just get over it. You talk about poos all the time. It's totally fine. It's a very healthy thing to talk about. I suppose the taboo is the problem. Not talking about it can actually cause a lot more harm in the world than it can good. And I suppose talking about it is very important. I also talk about it to everyone and everyone. And I know sometimes it may be inappropriate, because sometimes I'll be on a date and I'll just be like, start talking about what a healthy bowel movement is all about.
I love that for you. Why not just break down the stigma one date at a time?
That's it. Well, this is the thing about gut health. I mean, it is still in its infancy, wouldn't you say, as a science? Because when it comes down to, say, microbiome, when it comes down to general gut understandings, I mean, the amount of data and the amount of research that has been kind of poured into for the past 5 years is, again, it's just half a decade's worth of work, maybe around about a decade, but it's still very much in its infancy. We don't really know much else, except for example, what we focus on primarily right now in research is ratios within the gut of certain bacteria. We don't know the exact benefits of certain colonies over others, and we don't really have the tools in order to kind of say, well, what happens if this ratio is really high, and what happens here, and what happens here. What we do know is from doing the samples of populations and saying, well, we assume this population is healthy, and so this is the average ratio of microbes within this individual. So, and this is a generally healthy individual. So we'll take that as the gold standard and apply it to everyone. But I suppose everyone is different, wouldn't you agree? And I suppose from your practice, have you kind of come across certain things within the science? And, because obviously you've been doing this for about 10 years. I suppose the question then is, has there been rapid changes in your approach to it when it comes to gut health from the research that has come out within that time?
Yes, and it's so interesting, isn't it, the time frame? The last 5 years, pretty much since we could look into the gut microbiome properly, and before that it was just handfuls of species. We had the old diagnostics 10 years ago where it was just grow the culture in the lab setting and see what popped up, and then it transitioned to PCR DNA technology, and now we can actually look at the full insights of, up to 30,000 species. But as you mentioned, that's only in the last couple of years, and we're just uncovering, okay, well, what does that species do? What does it do if it's in a higher diversity? But does that affect everyone? Blah, 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 blah. There's so much to it. And it has changed so much in the clinical setting of treatment with what we gain and what we know step by step. Before that, we kind of presumed that we knew gut health, microbiome restoration was feeding them, but we didn't really know. But now we do know that their primary fuel source is prebiotic fiber diversity. So we could really see that in the science. So in a short answer, yes, it's changed rapidly.
Absolutely. So from that, would you say, from everything that you've known, and I suppose to our audience, to those who are considering, well, I probably need to take care a bit more about my gut health. I need to think about it more. Maybe I'm someone who has neglected my gut health. Maybe I'm a nutritionist who has just never considered gut health as a priority because I don't know anything about it. What tips would you provide to someone like me, or the the idea of someone like me, on gut health? What are the main tips and tricks would you provide? What would you say to them in terms of gut health? What should they focus on?
So what I do say to people, and to go into the testing aspect path, is if you haven't had a proper diagnostic test, it is always a really good idea to look in, because as we were sort of chatting about before, there are a lot of elements to gut health, and they're not limited to just a few I'll reel off, which we can look at in testing. That's, parasitology. Are there any external invaders that have popped in at some point? And they can be opportunistic pathogens that can strike at any time, particularly if the immune system gets knocked down. And then we've got things like the permeability. So that's sort of been labeled as leaky gut these days. I don't know if that's what it's called over there.
Oh, it is, yeah.
Okay, cool. But that's like detrimental. We know that has huge impacts on the body. It's basically every time you eat, is something leaking into the bloodstream and causing an immune attack. We have the immune barrier. So these are the things that help keep these baddies out. So many elements. And if you haven't had a test, it's really good to have a look before you start going and buying the next expensive, tummy gummy or fix your gut powder or probiotic, which, as we touched on before, we know a lot more about microbiome now, and probiotics don't quite hit the mark. So getting a test is a good idea, because then you can see where all those biomarkers are at and what aspect you need to treat. And then I'll just add something onto that too, which is the small intestine. And that's, if you're reacting to anything in the first couple of hours, it's a really good idea to get breath testing, and it's called lactulose breath testing here. And I believe that you can gain it in most big countries now, and that will give you a good insight for the most part. That's obviously, not every test is always conclusive, and there are other aspects to it, but it gives us an idea whether you have bacteria in your small intestine. So IBS isn't a diagnostic label these days. You can look further, and that sometimes is small intestinal bowel overgrowth. So you can add that in, and then you can go forward and really be targeted with, okay, what do I need to do for my gut health? Because that that'll give you the key insights to where you have to start.
Amazing. Well, there you go, audience. You now know what the next steps you should be taking are. But I actually want to introduce our audience to something even more interesting, which is, as a gut expert, you recently published a program aptly titled "It's a Gut Thing."
Yes.
Tell me a bit more about this program.
Yes, that came about so long ago. I thought, gosh, there's not enough of this information that I'm talking about now out. There's a collective bunch of practitioners worldwide. There are a lot of great leading doctors in this space, Alison Seibecker and a few other people leading in this, the sort of area of small intestinal bowel overgrowth, slowly becoming more frontline, and people are becoming more aware. But really it was, okay, it's out there. There are people talking about it, but there's not a lot of access to really get educated or empower yourself. So I thought, well, I'll just put it together and offer that for people, so they can really get the education, feel empowered, and know all of these aspects that we're talking about, identify their symptoms for themselves, and also have all that information around testing, which can be a bit hit and miss when you're going to practitioners that don't know about it.
Well, I wanted to know about more the structure then. How does it kind of work? Is it a set amount of weeks? Is it online? And how, if I enroll, would I go about learning all these great innovations, or how would I go about understanding or uncovering the veil of gut health and nutrition from a gut health perspective, I suppose?
That's a good question. And I thought deeply about this. I thought, for myself and everybody that I know, everybody's so busy. And, we have these great, kind of visions of doing these courses and just not having the time or not following through. So I developed these deliverables to be in short videos and downloads so that the patient can do it at any time, the person can do it at any time and go at their own pace. And it sort of just connects them with visual. Also, if you are a person that, reads and you're able to download that information better that way, you've got that in text. And then also each step of the way, tools to help them identify their symptoms and really look within and get serious with themselves. And there's a bit of a holistic overview in there as well. It's not just what's your tummy symptoms. It's really getting serious about what else is happening as well.
And what kind of people would you advise? I mean, what is the target group? Who would you advise to enroll onto this program to achieve what, and what do you hope they can achieve through this program overall?
So the target group is not limited to anyone with tummy symptoms, and that I would reel them off because we don't always know about them all. Chronic reflux, constipation, obviously urgent stools, and then
We've all been there.
We've all been there. Upset migrating liver complex. And we all know all too well that really uncomfortable bloating, excess gas, embarrassing, not fun. So we all know those, and they're really important. Obviously, if you're suffering from that, that's a number one key sign to just delve in and see what's happening with your gut health. But people are unaware that there are so many other links. So as we mentioned, there are links to the immune system. So anyone with chronic low immunity or autoimmunity, inflammatory condition, mental health conditions as well, because as just sort of touched on, we know that we have an enteric nervous system which directly links our gut to our brain. And 90% of our serotonin is made in our gut and sent to our brain. So hugely important if you're suffering from any mood disorders to make sure that you delve into that too, because it really touches on all that, just educates the person about the links of these health conditions to the gut as well.
I mean, I for sure will be signing up. I don't know about everyone else, but I definitely, you sold it on me. So I'll be signing up in the next few days. I think it'd be great, something to read. I mean, I always find that no matter how much I know about something, there's always something more to know. And from how you discussed today, your knowledge on gut health is just immaculate. So I have no issue in thinking to myself that I have a lot to learn, and also that I feel like this program will probably provide me with all that essential learning as well. So I'll be definitely checking that out after. I know we have to cut this episode a little bit short today. So what I want to do is start off just by asking one last little question before we go. And that is, we have this little fun thing on the Nutritionist podcast, which essentially I started a few months back, well, a few months ago with our first guest. And I don't know if you have the same program in Australia, but it's something called Desert Island Discs. And in this, there are 3 albums that someone has to choose if they're going to take to a desert island. But obviously, we're not doing Desert Island Discs. We're doing the Nutritionist podcast. Ergo, 3 foods that you wish to bring to a desert island. So, Jan, what are your 3 foods that you would bring to a desert island? Remember, the question is a completely open-ended one. Whether there's a stove on the island, whether there's running water on the island, that is completely for you to say. I will not set or impose limitations on this. So if you think there's a freshwater river already there, then you don't need to bring water. And if you think there's an oven there, then you can bring as much food as you want. Well, that's only 3, but you can bring certain foods that require cooking, for the cooking apparatus will already be there. So give me your 3 top foods.
Oh my gosh, I do love this. This is so fun. And I do love the idea of being stranded with amenities. Nice one. Okay. Well, I would rank my number one, and that's an absolute no-brainer for me, as coffee. And that is because I'm not addicted, but I am in a committed relationship with coffee. And I don't know about anyone else, but yeah, the relationship's going pretty strong. So don't want to let that one lapse. And it sounds like there might be boiling water somewhere, so I don't have to just eat the beans.
Yeah, you got a geothermal vent, so it's all good. It's already there. Just put your coffee beans in, and it's going to be a geothermal coffee vent. There you go.
Oh, amazing. Oh, when do we go? I'm just going to pack my bag now. So we got three. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I would take something I could grow, like a blueberry bush, because that's got a lot of nutrients in it, right? And then I grow it and I get more. And
teach a man to fish on, I love that. No one has mentioned seeds in this entire time I've done this. That's actually a first time answer on that. Bring the thing that actually grows the blueberries. Who would have thought?
Well, the only reason I thought of that is because the first thing you think of is people say go and find berries, but I would be the one that picked the poisonous berry and died in the first few hours. So I thought I better bring my own berries.
Good shout. Sure. Good shout.
Yeah.
So we have coffee and we have blueberries. So far, a very nice diet. I have to say, coffee and blueberries. That's going to be a tool for disaster.
Oh yeah, this is toilet paper on the island. Okay. Okay, well, the third one I would have to say, because I mean, I don't know what the train's going to be like. I could die really quickly. I don't know. So I feel like I'd want to go out happy, and I would take chocolate.
Good shout. But this is the big question: dark chocolate or milk chocolate or white chocolate? We have so many options these days.
No, if I'm going to be possibly dying, it's going to be the good stuff.
I love that. Cadbury or something.
It's good. I was like real nasty. I'm just going to go Cadbury.
Jan, this has been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for being on this podcast and informing our audience on everything gut health related. I quickly wanted to, before I end this podcast, I wanted to ask one last question. If I can push you, I know we're short on time, but for all those aspiring nutritionists out there, those potentially at university right now, or those who've just started their own business, those of us who potentially are starting out, maybe the clients aren't just there yet, and they're feeling a little bit disheartened by it all. They don't know what to do. What advice would you give to them as someone, a veteran nutritionist? What advice would you give to someone like that? And yeah, how would what key bits of I suppose advice would you provide that would give them sort of the strength to continue with their mission?
Oh, that's a good question, isn't it? We all set out really heart driven, and we just want to go out and help people as a collective whole, practitioners in that space. We're all really quite caring, and we just want to go out and help. And I found that I did get told this in the beginning, but it became more aware how important it was years in, and that was finding your niche, following the aspect that you're most passionate about. That will get you through all of the hardships and also really help you to niche into an area of business that possibly you become quite successful in, because that's obviously your key drive. Because often we diversify ourselves out. I find anybody that comes to me like for mentoring, it's just we kind of spread ourselves out and we want to help everyone with every condition. But yeah, that's something that I think is really important. Yeah,
absolutely. I'll take that. I think that's so important. Often, I mean, even myself, I've fallen a victim of trying to stretch myself out too thin, trying to be the expert on everything rather than recognizing that actually, much like a PhD candidate who goes on to do their doctorate, they're not specializing in everything, and maybe they might be a genius, but it's very much on one thing. And it doesn't need to be on everything. They don't need to stretch themselves thin and try to be the cure-all for all things. We don't live in we don't live in that generation anymore of the elixir of one cure-all for everything. Although some nutritionists will swear by one thing and one thing alone, and that's great, and they'll say that's the cure for all diseases all the time. But nevertheless, having a passion for one thing will definitely provide you with that sense of clarity as to who you want on your within your client list, and also provide you with that sense of expertise that I suppose you just don't get if you stretch yourself too thin. They often say, jack of all trades or a master at none. But often a trade of many is better than none, I suppose. I don't know how that rhyme goes. I don't know if I've said it right.
Hey, you're a
but God
poet
knows.
and you didn't know it.
Great. I love that. We finished that with a rhyme as well. Jan, thank you so much for being on the podcast again. I'm going to inform the audience that all the links to Jan's website, social media, and everything in between will be posted in the description of this video. On top of that, I'm sure you can reach out to her on her social media, and I'm sure she'll respond, so her details would be provided. I wish to thank you all again for taking time to listen to this podcast. And from me and Jan, goodbye.
Bye. Thanks for having me, guys. See ya.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Nutritionist Podcast. Just to remind you, this podcast is brought to you by NutriAdmin.com, the all-in-one software for nutritionists and dietitians that allows you to run your practice efficiently and all in one place. NutriAdmin has been serving thousands of nutritionists, dietitians, and personal trainers since 2016. The software is rated 4.7 stars out of 5 amongst users. New features and improvements are being added all the time. To learn more about how NutriAdmin can help you cut down on paperwork, create meal plans, and handle your admin work more effectively and efficiently, please visit NutriAdmin.com. We offer a 14-day free trial, and if you enter the promo code podcast50, that's podcast50, all in caps, upon sign up, you'll get 50% off for the first 2 months of your subscription. Thank you very much.